Hello and welcome to this tutorial where I will explain how to use the new live simulation feature on the Carbon simulation node. First up, we have a scene, and if I move it, you can see that our FPS on the viewport is over 120, obviously. We have a cloth, we have a rigid body, and then we have two colliders, a torus and a box. If I reset the simulation and run the simulation, you can see it runs around 30 to 35 frames per second, which is a good time. It's very interactive, so once we run the live simulation, we should expect similar results. All right, let's get started. I click on a Carbon simulation node and go up in the parameters. Live simulation is a new tab. We can start and end the simulation, and we can reset. Let's do this. Press start. You can see the simulation is running without moving the timeline. So the timeline stays wherever you are right now, maybe on 1 or 2, and so on. Pressing end will pause the simulation. We can press start again, and it will just pick up where we were, and end and start. Once I'm done, press end again, and now I can either save out the geometry or I can reset the simulation if I want to remove my current progress or results. So reset will reset it, you cannot get it back, so make sure to be careful when pressing reset. Again, start, end, reset. Now, besides just running the pure simulation in a gamified mode, you can also pick objects. So you can pick and move cloth, which is a dynamic object, and a rigid body. Picking parameters here: max distance, radius, and strength scale. First, let me show you how it works. If I press start with the default parameters, now hover my mouse over the cloth, you can see a white bounding box appearing. Similarly, when I move my mouse over the rigid body, we see the rigid body white bounding box appearing. This means my object is now traced. We're performing a ray test that checks for objects basically in the ray from the camera to the mouse. And here again, we are over the cloth. Let me end and reset. The ray distance, the maximum capture distance that the ray will accept, is defined here with max distance. Now, if I set this to, for example, 0.1, and this scene here is in meters, we will be way too short. Let me press start and I move my mouse over here. We can see nothing is traced because the objects are too far away. So make sure when you don't see any white bounding box to double check your max distance and adjust it. You do not have to reset the simulation to change these parameters. So I just pressed end without resetting simulation. I can set it back to 100, continue simulation by pressing start, and we now see our white bounding box appearing. If I now left mouse button click, I can select an object and it goes from traced into picked because I've picked the object. Similarly, cloth traced, and now we have it picked. I'm moving it, it's still simulating, so it will still interact with the environment. Similar to the rigid body here, will still interact with the environment. I can try to move it through the floor, and you see this happens. So let's go to the other parameters. Let me end and reset the simulation. The radius is used for picking cloth. It controls how many points are being used to pick the cloth. A larger radius will capture more points, a smaller radius, less points. Default radius of 1, and we have a scene in meters, and our cloth is just 1.2 meters long when it's flat. We will see that now when I pick, actually every point of the whole cloth is being picked, which is usually not what you want. So again, we do not have to reset the simulation, but we do have to end the simulation. So pause it. I can change the radius now. It's 0.1, which means a radius of 10 centimeters. Let's press start again. The new parameters are being valid. And we can see a smaller circle of the point is being selected. Might still be too big. Let's pause it again by pressing end. And let's choose 3 centimeters. Pressing start again. And here we go. This is a smaller selection. Let me best reset the simulation and start. And you can see we have a smaller circle is being selected. And now we can drag and pull and push our cloth around. Now, when I select an object and here the cloth, and I, for example, try to push it through the floor, I'm actually succeeding. And this will corrupt the cloth and it will fight the collision with the floor. Similar, our rigid body here. If I pull it down and try to move through the floor, it gets trapped. And this is not good for the simulation because we obviously have now the collision fighting our picking. It might pop through, it might get stuck. It is not very great. So what do we want to do? We actually want to bring down the strength scale, which controls how much power, how much force we're allowed to use to pull something. Let me end this. Let me just reset. And I will now bring the strength scale down quite a lot to 0.01, so by a factor of 100. Let me start again. And I'm selecting the cloth. You can tell that I'm not pulling the cloth, but my scale is pretty weak because it lags behind. you see a white line appearing between the cloth and where my mouse is. So this marks that my strength scale might not be strong enough. If I move my cloth here over the floor, you can see it's not even strong enough to hold the cloth up against gravity. Let me end and reset the simulation again. Let me bring it up to 0.1. Let's press start again. And if I hold the cloth now and lift it, you can see that it is hanging on my picking anchor and is not falling under gravity. If I move around a bit, you can see that it's falling quite nicely with not much delay. So this means I have a pretty strong strength. And now let's try to push through the floor. And there's more resistance to pushing through the floor. Similar on the rigid body, it still kind of goes in, so maybe my strength is still too strong. Let me end and reset the simulation. I'm going to halve it now, 0.05. Let's start. Again, the first test is, can I pick the cloth without it falling under gravity? That is much better. We can still move it, and we can see some delay when I move very fast. That's pretty good. All right, we wiped the rigid body. Let me end and reset the simulation. Similarly, the rigid body, can I put it through the floor? No. You can see the constraint is now failing, and the rigid body and the floor collision is being resolved properly without me trying to push it through. So 0.05 seems to be a good value. There we go. All right, I can try to move the cloth. Well, let's see if we can move the cloth, for example, through the torus. So you can use this feature to style your scene, to wrap things around others, drape it over, and so on. Now let's move on to the last section of parameters. We have hotkeys for stasis picked and stasis traced. So as the name says, stasis picked or stasis traced allows to put object into stasis mode. You can change your hotkeys to whatever you want, default at G and H. If I now start a simulation, I now have my cloth traced. I'm not clicking anything with my mouse, and I can press H to set it into stasis mode and H again to move it out of stasis mode. If I select an object, now I have it selected, it is picked. I can press G, let go, and it's in stasis mode. I hover over it again. G won't work if I'm pressing on my keyboard, but nothing is happening. Press H because we are in trace mode and not in picked. H, and it is removed from stasis mode. Let me end and reset the simulation again. So why do we have both stasis picked and stasis traced? Well, this is because sometimes you might want to put an object into stasis without selecting it. Or sometimes you have an object selected, like this rigid here. We have it under the floor, but we want to now change the stasis mode of our cloth without letting go of the rigid. So rigid is still selected. I'm still holding down the left mouse button. It is being picked, but now our cloth is traced. So I can press H and our cloth is now in stasis mode, but I never had to let go of the rigid body. All right, let me press start again, and we can verify again with around 30-35 FPS. It changes a lot, but we're very interactive. As you can see, we can interact with it. You need to make sure that the simulation is quite interactive. If I had a case where I had more iterations and subdivisions, for example 2020, let me reset the simulation, press start again, and we're down to 14-15 frames per second, then it is a bit harder, but it's still feasible. Now if I have a much higher resolution cloth, you're going to get even more problems. Let me start this. Oops, I forgot to reset. Okay, let me start now. What we can see, we are much lower frames per second, and it is really hard to interact with this object. So you want to make sure to usually use this picking either for just small tasks, if you have high resolution geometry where you don't need to move too much, or you want to use it for tasks on lower resolution geometry where you get the speed you need. Well, I hope this makes sense and you have fun using this feature. Thank you for watching.